I'm a death lawyer, and I deal with a lot of sensitive and challenging issues around death. One of the most difficult is families fighting over funerals. And that actually happens a lot, and some of you may actually have personal experience of fights within your own families. Something that families tend to disagree over is whether their loved one should be buried or cremated. Now, that's a difficult enough choice if you have only two choices to choose from. But burial and cremation are no longer the only ways of dealing with our dead. But why does it matter? Well, the reality is it's inevitable that every single one of us is going to die. By the time I finished my talk tonight, over 1,000 people will have died. Not a pleasant thought, but true. It doesn't matter who we are, it doesn't matter what we do, it doesn't matter where we come from. We all leave behind the same physical legacy, and that's our bodies. But dead bodies are a problem. Why? Because they're organic material and they decompose. And that process will start within several minutes of death. So we need a way of dealing with our dead, not just from a public health angle, but out of the basic principle of respect for the dead. So every funeral will have, as part of it, the process for dealing with the body. We're all familiar with burial, we're all familiar with cremation, but new methods are entering the funeral landscape. And those new methods are going to make us reimagine the ways in which we deal with our dead, the ways we deal with our bodies of our loved ones, and with our own bodies when the time comes. Now, I'd like to speak to two new methods today, which are available in some countries and are attracting a lot of attention. And I realize that some of the details that I'm about to come up with are a little bit graphic. The first method is what's called alkaline hydrolysis, sometimes referred to as water cremation. Some of you might be familiar with that method. It's what Archbishop Desmond Tutu chose for his funeral before his death last year. What happens with alkaline hydrolysis? The body is placed into a steel container. Water is added with some sort of alkaline chemical. The container is gently warmed over several hours, and the organic material of the body dissolves. And what you're left with is a sterile liquid and bones, which can be reduced into a fine powder and given back to the family, pretty much the same way as post-cremation ashes. The other method is what's called natural organic reduction, also known as human composting. What happens here? The body is placed into a specialized container. Natural materials are added, for example, wood chips, straw. The temperature and humidity conditions are tightly controlled. And over several weeks, bacteria and other microorganisms break down the body. The end result, a nutrient-dense soil, which can be used to plant a tree. So what's behind these new methods? Well, one is giving us more choice. But the much bigger driver is the environment. There's this idea that if we're going to live greener, then we have to think about dying greener as well. And these new technologies are marketed as being more environmentally friendly ways of dealing with our dead. But I'm a death lawyer. So when I hear about these new methods, I ask myself two questions. The first one is maybe something that you're thinking about already. Are these methods actually legal? In my opinion, they are. Unless a country has really restrictive rules around how you treat your dead, or has passed laws banning these new methods, then they are legal by default. The bigger question, how are we going to regulate these new methods? And I think that's a really important question. And we need some sort of regulatory framework for alkaline hydrolysis and human composting. Why? Because it protects the companies who've invested lots of money in coming up with these new technologies, and law wants to encourage innovation where it can. But it's also important for us as potential consumers, as potential users of these new technologies. We want to be reassured that they are safe, dignified, and public health compliant ways of dealing with our dead, and that they have basic legal standards applicable to them in pretty much the same way as burial and cremation do. So law is going to set a really important regulatory context here. What it's not going to do, it's not going to force us to suddenly move to alkaline hydrolysis or human composting. Burial and cremation will still be available. Likewise, I think the fact that these methods are legal and that they're being regulated is not something that's going to cause us all to suddenly switch over. Because ultimately, how we choose our bodies to be dealt with, or what we choose as the arrangements for our family and our friends and our loved ones, they're highly sensitive. They're really, really personal choices. So what sort of things are going to influence us? We're going to be guided by tradition. We may want to stick with what we're familiar with. Another driver is going to be cost. How affordable are these new technologies compared to burial and compared to cremation? Don't forget that our religious and cultural views also shape our beliefs around how we should treat our dead. That's a big factor. Some of you listening to these technologies, me talking about them perhaps for the first time, you might be thinking, I'm not comfortable with this as an idea. I don't like the sound of it. I'm not comfortable with various aspects of the process. I'm not keen on the idea of dissolving a body, of the process of decomposition taking several weeks. But some of you might be listening this evening and thinking, yeah, I'd like to know more about these. They sound interesting, and I'm swayed by the environmental arguments. Again, that's a good thing. But a word of caution here. Every process that we use to deal with our dead will leave some sort of carbon footprint. The bigger thing to think about here sometimes is the environmental impact of the funeral itself. So when we think about it, there's a distance that people travel to funerals. There are funeral cars. There's the material used in the coffin or the shroud or whatever you place the corpse in. There's a carbon footprint there. Think about the flowers that we have in floral displays at funerals. Where do we source those from? Think about the plastics in the floral displays. Think about the gravestones, the memorial tombs. All those things leave a carbon footprint. And if you're thinking about that idea of dying greener, then think about the bigger environmental impact of the funeral overall. So, at the end of the day, we have these choices. We have the ability to make the decisions. What I want to challenge you and encourage you to do is think about the options available, do some research, look at what's out there, and to have those conversations, to think about what you want and to talk about it with the people who you're closest to in life. Now, I know those are difficult conversations. They're emotional. We don't really want to think about dying. We don't want to have those hard conversations. But I think it's important that we do. I've had the conversation with my husband. We've both talked about it. Yes, the long winter evenings absolutely fly by in our house when we're talking about these things. But seriously, it is important to think about it. It's important to talk about it. Why? Well, going back to my opening scenario, I talked about families fighting over funerals. If you know what the deceased wanted, you may be able to prevent those sorts of conflicts from happening. The more important reason, I think, is that if you've lost a loved one, you know how difficult that is. You know how emotionally challenging it is. You know what toll that takes on you. And you also know that a lot of decisions have to be made, and those decisions have to be made within a fairly short space of time. If you knew what the individual wanted, you have a clear steer, you have a clear decision-making point to help you make those choices. And it can also help you, perhaps in the grieving process, thinking, I've done what this person wanted. So, think about it. Know the options. Think what you'd like to happen. Have the conversation with the people that you're closest to in life. And in the meantime, live life to the full and enjoy every minute of it. Thank you.